A shadow the size of a building shatters the surface of the ocean, towering directly over 6 men in a wooden rowboat. The crew rows toward a liquid commodity worth $200,000, a fortune trapped inside the animal's flesh. To understand why anyone would fight a sea beast, look at the energy vacuum of the pre-industrial world. Expanding cities pitched into total darkness at sunset, and the heavy metal gears of early factories ground to a halt. Electricity did not exist, and no one knew how to pump oil from the ground. The only fuel source dense enough to solve this crisis was locked away inside a thick shield of blubber, roaming the deepest parts of the ocean. Lighting the world was a mathematical problem. Securing enough energy required a global empire dedicated to hunting the largest animals on Earth. For centuries, coastal communities simply scavenged dead whales that washed ashore. By the 8th century, the Basques along the Bay of Biscay formalized the process, building stone watchtowers to spot breaches and launching fleets of small boats armed with hand-thrown harpoons. They targeted the North Atlantic right whale. At 18 meters long, it was slow, lived close to the coastline, and stayed afloat after it died. Every piece of the animal had value. The whale's mouth contained hundreds of plates of baleen, a flexible protein that served as the plastic of the 18th century, used in everything from armor to corset stays. Boiling down the blubber produced a versatile oil. It waterproofed ships, provided the base for soaps, and burned cleaner than any other illuminant available. This map of 18th century London shows that demand. By the 1740s, 15,000 street lamps lit the roads, consuming half a whale every night. This insatiable appetite decimated nearshore populations, and as demand for light peaked, the easy supply collapsed. Profit-hungry sailors left the safety of the shallows and pushed out into the deep ocean to find the remaining giants. The industry shifted when a storm swept a Nantucket crew far offshore, where they killed an entirely different target, the deep-water sperm whale. Inside the heads of these predators sat a chamber filled with spermaceti. This milky liquid burned smoke-free, making it the most coveted illuminating fuel on the planet. This diagram shows the physical absurdity of the task. Men rowed up to a 45-ton creature in a boat the size of a canoe, because a single large sperm whale could yield $200,000 in today's money. To secure that payout, sailors endured the Nantucket Sleigh Ride. Once the steel harpoon buried its barb in the animal's flesh, the whale would bolt, dragging the tiny boat through the waves for up to 8 hours. Success meant turning the ship into a floating factory. Men boiled blubber in brick furnaces right on the wooden decks, working through the stench of rotting meat and the constant risk of being scalded by boiling oil. By the 1850s, this lethal labor fueled a massive venture capital machine. The extraction of marine wealth built quiet New England villages into the wealthiest commercial hubs in America. In 1859, steam-powered rigs began commercially pumping crude petroleum. Refined kerosene was suddenly cheap and plentiful, ending the dominance of whale oil for lighting homes. Paradoxically, the petroleum boom accelerated the slaughter. While kerosene replaced whale oil in lamps, the heavy machinery of the industrial age required a lubricant that wouldn't freeze or break down under pressure. The demand simply moved from lighting to lubrication. Hunters upgraded their tools to meet this industrial need. Hand-thrown spears were replaced by steam-powered ships and explosive-tipped harpoons, turning the open ocean into a factory floor. This chart reveals the ecological math of the 20th century. As global fleets fed the industrial war machine, the blue whale population collapsed by 98%, falling from 340,000 to fewer than 5,000. The slaughter remained largely hidden until the 1970s, when environmental activists steered tiny inflatable boats into the crosshairs of Soviet harpoons. The resulting public outcry finally forced a global moratorium on commercial whaling in 1986. The history of whaling shows that the expansion of mechanized industry was achieved through the calculated dismantling of the ocean's greatest giants. Technological progress and ecological destruction moved in lockstep. Imagine a sprawling metropolis like 18th century London, swallowed by complete physical darkness the moment the sun goes down. To turn those dark streets into a flickering sea of light, And to keep the gears of early machinery from grinding to a halt, humanity desperately needed a reliable fuel. The first answer came from the coast. Settlers hunted slow-moving right whales for their buoyant, oil-rich bodies, and for baleen, the bristly filter from the whale's mouth, seen here in this 19th century corset. This material functioned as a flexible, durable precursor to modern plastic. But the true prize lay much further offshore. When a crew was swept out into the deep Atlantic, they brought down an entirely different kind of giant, the sperm whale. Inside the massive heads of these creatures was a chamber holding thousands of liters of spermaceti, a milky gold liquid that burned brighter and cleaner than any substance on Earth, without producing a drop of smoke. The discovery of this incredibly pure oil turned what had been an opportunistic coastal practice into a global commercial enterprise. Nations scrambled to build fleets, chasing a resource so valuable it eventually grew into the 5th largest industry in America. This chart shows the massive financial barrier standing between a crew and that liquid gold. In the 1850s, an expedition required an investment of roughly $30,000. But look at the return. A single sperm whale could yield oil worth $200,000. That was 10 times the cost of an average farm. For a poor, rocky coastal town, bringing down just one of these animals meant generational wealth. Success depended on killing an 18-meter, 45-ton intelligent predator. This was an animal with a massive brain, fully capable of smashing ships and fighting back against its pursuers. The mechanics of the hunt required men to row fragile wooden boats into the open ocean, pull up alongside the thrashing leviathan, and physically touch it to drive a weapon through its skin. The entire 19th century lighting economy relied on this deadly gamble, where crews of desperate men risked their lives for a share of the payout. The oarsmen strain in total silence until the hull of the rowboat is scraping the animal. The harpooner stands, braces himself firmly, and hurls a rusted iron spear until it bites deep into the blubber. Immediately, the ocean erupts. The startled giant transforms into pure, terrified rage, thrashing its massive tail and diving to escape the sting. The harpoon line snaps taut, violently jerking the tiny wooden boat forward. The crew is suddenly being dragged across the open ocean at the speed of a steam engine, blinded by saltwater spray in a terrifying ordeal the whalers called the Nantucket Sleigh Ride. This pursuit often stretched for 8 grueling hours. Men gripped the gunwales while waves crashed over the bow, waiting for the beast to tire. Every second was a lethal hazard. The thick ropes attached to the harpoon lashed across the deck like they were alive. If a sailor's leg caught a loop, he would be instantly yanked overboard and dragged down into the crushing pressure of the depths. And the target wasn't always alone. Distressed whales would often call out, drawing massive, furious kin to rush the boats and defend their pod. Surviving the sleigh ride required no finesse. You simply held on, relying on raw physical endurance and blind luck to outlast an enraged force of nature. Eventually, the rope goes slack. The whale, utterly exhausted from pulling a heavy wooden boat and 6 men across miles of ocean, slows to a halt. Now comes the execution. The rowers pull close one last time. The harpooner takes a 3-meter lance and repeatedly plunges it into the animal, searching for the massive lungs or heart. When he finds the mark, the whale's spout turns into a thick crimson geyser, raining blood down onto the water. In its final moments, the leviathan swims in tight, disoriented circles, vomiting up half-digested squid. Finally, the 45-ton body shudders and rolls over in a spreading pool of gore. The deafening chaos of the hunt is replaced by the eerie stillness of a dead giant bobbing in the swells. But for the exhausted crew, the true physical nightmare is just about to begin. The crew tows the immense carcass back to the main ship. They slam heavy iron chains around the animal, securing it tightly against the groaning wooden hull. The ship becomes a slaughterhouse. Men swing axes through the head to raid the spermaceti vault. Using pulleys that strain the ship's masts, they rip away strips of blubber called blinket pieces, each weighing a ton, and haul them onto the deck. On the wooden deck, they fire up the try-works, massive brick furnaces. The blubber is dumped into iron pots and boiled down into precious liquid oil. The working conditions were grueling. Men labored around the clock, choking on thick black smoke and the stench of rotting flesh. A single slip on the greasy deck meant broken bones, deadly burns from boiling oil, or a fall into waters swarming with sharks. In a matter of days, the crew systematically reduces a majestic, ancient creature into standardized wooden barrels of liquid capital. As the decades passed, the hunt transitioned from sail to steam power. The arrival of explosive-tipped harpoons meant whalers could chase down the fastest, largest animals on Earth. The practice grew into a mechanized slaughter, anchored by massive permanent processing stations, much like this one in the Antarctic. By the mid-20th century, the industry reached a terrifying peak, known as the Whaling Olympics. Massive factory ships processed tens of thousands of whales a year, with deck machinery capable of disassembling dozens of carcasses in a single day. In 1964 alone, fleets killed over 82,000 whales. The ocean couldn't sustain this mechanized assault. Blue whale populations, some of the largest animals to ever exist, collapsed by 98%, leaving fewer than 5,000 survivors. The carnage only halted when public perception shifted in the 1970s. Activists began steering inflatable boats directly into the path of steel harpoons to protect their targets. This cultural rejection eventually led to a global moratorium that effectively banned commercial whaling in 1986. The history of whaling is a story of incredible risk and industrial slaughter. Yet, before the first oil wells were drilled, the liquid treasure found inside these giants provided the smokeless light for city streets and the lubricants that kept early industrial machines turning. The moment the romanticized hunt ends, the real work begins. The whale is dead, but the ship transforms into a brutal, floating assembly line. Secured alongside the hull is a carcass so enormous it makes the ship groan under the strain. The crew uses massive pulleys to peel away thick strips of fat, with each single piece weighing hundreds of kilograms. This raw blubber is hauled onto a violently swaying deck that quickly becomes coated in a treacherous mix of grease, seawater, and blood. One wrong step can send a man sliding directly beneath swinging chains or thousands of pounds of falling weight. Yet nobody slows down. Men work through exhaustion, sleeping only a few hours at a time, driven by the absolute rule of the whaling industry. Every hour wasted is profit lost. The whaling ship functioned as a floating slaughterhouse and industrial plant, designed to process high volumes of raw biological material thousands of miles from the nearest port. This diagram shows the anatomy of a sperm whale, but the target is here, the enormous head. Inside lies spermaceti, a waxy oil that burns bright and clean. The crew cuts into the skull to bail it out, treating the fluid like liquid wealth. Once the head is emptied, the remaining blubber must be processed in the tryworks. These are massive brick furnaces, built directly onto the wooden deck of the ship, holding giant iron pots over roaring fires. The men chop the remaining fat and boil it for hours. It is a sensory nightmare. Sailors risk terrible burns from splashing oil, and they are constantly enveloped in an unforgettable, suffocating stench of burning fat and rotting flesh. Beneath them, the ocean reacts to the slaughter. Drawn by blood pouring over the sides, massive sharks swarm the waters, circling day and night. Through days of grueling labor and intense heat, an immense biological apex predator is completely dismantled and reduced into uniform wooden barrels of fuel. The barrels of oil offloaded at ports like New Bedford funded the construction of massive warehouses, docks, and private mansions for a new merchant class. The merchants, ship owners, and investors who financed these expeditions accumulated enormous profits, building powerful local empires entirely subsidized by whale oil. But the men actually doing the butchering and boiling rarely saw a fraction of that money. Most crews weren't paid a regular wage. They worked under the lay system, earning a tiny percentage of the voyage's total profits. If a ship returned light, a sailor could easily step off a multi-year expedition with absolutely nothing, or owing the captain for supplies. Yet fleets had no trouble finding men. The desperate, remote chance of striking it rich was enough to keep thousands signing up for the punishment. Ultimately, the massive industrial fortunes of early America relied entirely on the high-risk, largely unpaid labor of these disposable crews. By the mid-1800s, this operation had expanded from a specialized, localized trade into one of the largest and most vital economic engines in the United States. This map displays the massive geographical scale of the hunt. Thousands of ships relentlessly scoured the oceans to maintain supply, and this chart illustrates why. Two massive industrial demands climbed simultaneously. Expanding cities required oil for illumination, and new factories needed it for lubrication. As the 1850s approached, the industry showed no signs of slowing. Merchants continued to commission larger ships and plan longer voyages to meet the insatiable global market. Looking back, the peak of the whaling industry represents humanity's most extreme attempt to extract and secure energy before modern technology caught up. But that massive global empire was abruptly disrupted in 1859. The alternative didn't come from a new hunting ground in the ocean. It was found deep beneath the dirt. In Pennsylvania, a man named Edwin Drake drilled the first commercial petroleum well. The exact moment this black liquid surfaced, the ground oil age began. While whaling would not disappear instantly, petroleum offered a cheaper, more accessible alternative that drained investment away from high-risk expeditions at sea. Humanity slowly moved its focus from the surface of the ocean to the massive resources hidden beneath the earth, replacing the oil of the sperm whale with the fuel that would define the industrial age. Working the midnight shift on a 19th-century whaling ship meant navigating a deck slick with grease, seawater, and blood. Ropes groaned overhead in the dark, while the orange glow of massive brick furnaces illuminated men rendering down 100-kilogram strips of boiling fat. These furnaces, known as try-works, operated day and night to melt solid blubber into the oil that fueled the early industrial world. This was the substance that lubricated the first factory gears and lit the street lamps of London and New York. For the sailors, the work was a brutal physical gamble. They faced crushing bone injuries and horrific burns for a share of the profits rather than a fixed wage. If the ship returned with an empty hold, years of labor resulted in nothing but debt. Despite the risks, the global demand for lubrication was so high that it built entire cities. Wealthy port towns like New Bedford grew on the back of massive fleets of wooden ships, which were pushed further into every corner of the ocean to keep the industry alive. In 1859, the industry faced a potential collapse when drillers in Pennsylvania managed to strike liquid petroleum deep beneath the ground. This raw crude was refined into kerosene, a lighting fuel that was significantly cheaper and more abundant than whale oil. Within a few years, the market for burning whale fat for light vanished. It appeared that the age of whaling was over. With a new subterranean source of energy available, there was no longer a clear economic reason to send men and ships to hunt at sea. But the arrival of the fossil fuel era did not end the hunt. Instead, it provided the whaling industry with the engines and materials needed to accelerate the slaughter to its highest levels in history. Industrial-era innovations turned the traditional hunt into a highly efficient branch of mechanical engineering. Every physical advantage the whale possessed, its speed, its size, and its habitat, was systematically neutralized by new technology. The industry transitioned from wooden sailing ships to heavy, smoke-belching steel vessels powered by coal and diesel. These motorized ships outran even the fastest species of whale, and allowed crews to push deep into the previously impassable ice fields of the Antarctic. Dangerous hand-to-hand combat was replaced by heavy cannons that fired explosive-tipped harpoons. These weapons guaranteed a lethal strike from a distance, ending the era of the Nantucket Sleigh Ride, where whales could potentially fight back or escape. Hunters even found a mechanical solution for the biological weight of their prey. Because massive species like blue whales naturally sink when they die, crews used high-powered air compressors to pump the carcasses full of gas, ensuring they floated until they could be processed. By applying mechanized industrial processes to a biological resource, the industry effectively removed any chance of survival for the animals it targeted. Following World War II, Nations like Japan and the Soviet Union deployed the floating factory. These enormous vessels featured a rear slipway where entire blue whales were winched out of the water and directly onto a steel butcher's deck. These decks operated as floating industrial assembly lines. Ships no longer needed to return to port. They could butcher entire pods into canned meat and oil while remaining in the open ocean for months at a time. This chart tracks global whale kills. For over 100 years, wooden ships maintained a low baseline. As steam engines and explosive harpoons arrived, numbers climbed sharply. The data hits a terrifying peak in 1964. In that single year, fleets killed 80,000 whales. This relentless efficiency pushed the largest animals on Earth to the brink of biological collapse. The blue whale population alone was reduced by more than 99% from its pre-industrial levels. The whaling industry had become an extinction machine, a system so perfectly optimized for harvest that it was on the verge of destroying the very resource it relied on. In the late 20th century, new research into whale biology changed the narrative. Scientists documented profound intelligence, complex social structures, and song-like communication networks that could travel across entire oceans. As this information reached the public, the whale was redefined. It was no longer seen as an industrial commodity to be rendered into oil, but as a sentient social being that was essential to the health of the ocean. By the 1970s, this new empathy led to direct intervention. Activists in small inflatable boats began chasing the massive factory ships, positioning their own bodies between the whales and the explosive harpoons. The mechanized momentum of the hunt was finally slowed by a surge of organized public outrage. People around the world demanded that the industrial slaughter be brought to an immediate end. This global pressure led to the historic 1986 moratorium, an international agreement that effectively ended large-scale commercial whaling and saved several species from total disappearance. We now live in an era defined by two different versions of the whale, the creature that fueled the birth of modern industry with its death, and the living creature that inspired the birth of the modern environmental movement. The history of the whaling industry shows us that our progress is not measured by our ability to optimize the destruction of nature, but by our collective wisdom to recognize when we must stop.